to HEDG Hosts, a series of events run by the Historical Economics and Development Group at the University of Southern Denmark, where we invite some of the most incisive writers and thinkers inside and outside academia to present their work and demonstrate the relevance and continued impact of historical developments on contemporary societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Vincent Geloso from George Mason University. Vincent is an economic historian whose research interests lie at the intersection between North American economic history, population economics, and political economy. He's author of the book, Rethinking Canadian Economic Growth and Development Since 1900, back from 2017. We're very much looking forward to hearing his talk today on his ongoing work, Good, Bad, and Not Too Ugly, the economics of inequality and income mobility. And on a practical note, for those of you joining online, because this is the Zoom webinar format, you can't ask questions like over the microphone. You have to type them. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom webinar. It makes it much easier for me to sort of curate the questions, basically. Over to you. Thanks, Vincent.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to make sure you can see my screen.
I can.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm not sure if you guys are in for a treat or in for some form of torture. I'm sharing the essentially what is the first version of what is the next book that I am writing up that mixes two sets of literatures that I'm contributing to. One is the historical estimation of inequality, and the other one is the relationship between the role of markets in promoting income mobility. And there is a unifying theme through them, and I'm going to show you what that unifying theme is. It is the and it's in the title. It's the good, the bad, and the neutral, to make a pun on the good, the bad, and the ugly, or the good, the bad, and not too ugly variation on this. I'm still hesitating, but it is the idea that there are different types of inequality and how they impact our judgment of their implications for human well-being will then affect our understanding of policies. So just to give you what I think are the main takeaways that I would want you to keep from what I'm saying. First of all, people should stop freaking out over inequality. Inequality has risen in the last few decades, but by far less than people appreciate. Number two, in any case, what you need to care about is what you could call bad inequalities. And you want to think about bad inequalities as those that are tied to lesser chances of upward mobility. So you want to think about essentially the Great Gatsby curve. I'll show it to you in case you're not familiar with it, but the idea is that there might be some mechanism where inequality now speaks to less income mobility in the future for people in the lower ranks of the income distribution. Number three is, once you do this, you do this decomposition of good, bad, and neutral inequality, you get to a very different interpretation of what is the usual U curve of inequality in most Western countries. And that interpretation is very different than what is generally emphasized. And the last one, it also leads to different implications over how to push up income mobility. And I end up saying that while social policy / welfare state are not necessarily making things worse, they're far less effective than promoting markets are able to push up income mobility much more so, and it's underappreciated as an importance. Just to point it out, this is based on these are some of the references that I'm citing here. Many of them are from my own work, so I'll share with Paul afterwards the references so everyone can end up using them. But these are the ones I am using right now. So okay, so when I say stop freaking out, this is the first part of the main takeaway. Here, what I'm showing to you is in blue is the usual inequality estimates that are produced by Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman. And on the right, you have the share of all income that is captured by with the blue line for the top 10%, and on the right, it is for the top 1%. I want you to notice here the U curve pattern over the course of the 20th century, where there is a high level at the start that collapses very rapidly during the 1940s, with very little change from 1917 to 1941. This is for the United States, by the way, I should point it out. That there is a very high level initially, and most of the collapse happens with the blue line in the 1940s. There is a golden age of equality until the early 80s, and since then, inequality has re-increased massively. Now, I will also tell you that the estimates of Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zucman and Manuel Saez are, especially since I'm talking to a group of economic historians, you can appreciate the importance of reading footnotes in references you are using and primary sources, and checking through archives. There are, for the first half of the blue lines, this is where the red lines come in here. The estimates are, there's multiple problem in how the data was treated, how the data was entered, and there's even other ones that are harder to illustrate on this graph. But for now, when you make corrections to how the data was, how the primary sources were treated, you get a very different assessment. So first of all, the levels of inequality are generally were off in the Piketty estimates. So the red line is a revision that I made with Phil Magnus, Phil Schlosser, and John Moore, and the published in the Economic Journal. And here I want you to notice not only it's not as much the level that is important, but also the timing. In the Piketty and Saez story, the 1940s is the big deal. Here, I want you to notice that the leveling is mostly happening in the 1930s. So this is the Great Depression, seems to have a leveling effect. So that's the left side of the U curve. But I also want you to notice now the work of Otten, the Gerald Otten and David Splinter. So this is the red line, where they're trying to make for adjustments to multiple. So that's the controversy that was there in the fall, where they're re-estimating a lot of the post 1960 treatment of tax data to estimate inequality, and they do find an increase, but it is a much more modest increase. And finally, the yellow line that you have there is the work of Meckling, Miller, and I'm forgetting the last author. And what they're doing there is they're trying to account for the role of tax regime changes. So in the United States, people don't appreciate that when there used to be much lower corporate income taxes, people would have a different behavior on how they're consuming some form of expenditures as corporate expenditures, even though they end up being personal expenditures. And when the ratio of corporate to personal taxes changes, people change their reporting behavior, but in a way that creates non-meaningful changes in inequality as measured by using only income tax data, which is what the work of Thomas Piketty, Manuel Saez, and Gabriel Zucman does. And you end up that the low level from the golden age is not as low. And also you get a slightly different trend. So it's worth pointing it out that it means that in the 1980s, there wasn't as much as an increase, since the floor wasn't as low as generally depicted. So that's number one. More with regards to stop freaking out is there is a large share of the increase in income inequality that just comes from essentially a composition bias. The fact that we have now more people who are older, who are closer to prime age levels of earnings, and you have more people who are entering the labor market later because they're studying longer, and you also have more people who are also in retirement, you are going to get a change in what the composition of earnings is. And so making adjustments for the age makeup of the population does affect our understanding of trends. So here's an example from the work of Almas, and I think this is from the Journal of Economic Inequality. Uh, this is for Norway. What you're seeing here is Norway had declining earnings inequality in until the 1980s, and it's been increasing since the 1980s. But so this is the solid black line. But when you make adjustments for age makeup, so these are the two top lines, there is no change since the late 1960s to the 2000s. It's essentially a flat line. So making adjustments for age makeup of the population does affect our understanding of the evolution of inequality. So that's also an important. And the last one regarding the stop freaking out point is when you shift from income inequality to consumption, which will capture some of the life cycles issue in that you get with income over the lifetime. Consumption doesn't have many of these issues, and so there answers indirectly many of the concerns that composition bias may induce. Not all of them, but a large share. You find, and this is where the solid line here is, you're getting an increase in inequality over time, but when you shift to measures of consumption, you are getting an increase, and it is a much milder increase, but there is one. Uh, so that's it for the the stop freaking out point. But now I'm gonna say that even though I've said all of this, uh, I'm gonna make a form of a weird tactical retreat here. Is I'm going to say that I'm gonna concede that it's been increasing, and the degree to which it's increasing since the 1960s doesn't mean necessarily what a lot of people mean. So I'm going to try and give the argument I'm trying to assail the best possible. I'm going to try to Iron Man the position that I disagree with. And the reason for this, and this is, for example, I'm going to use some example because, unfortunately for all of you, I'm Canadian, so it's. I mean, there's disadvantages. So you will hear far more about Canada that you may have hoped for, uh, because this is where there's actually much better data than people appreciate. That's the reason why you'll hear about it, but also because I'm very familiar with the data. The concern people have with inequality is that there is this idea that it's going to speak in some way to income mobility. And there are good signs that income mobility has declined in the last decades. So this is intra-generational mobility in Canada. So what you're getting here is there are 5-year rolling windows. And we're going to use this data a lot, so I have to explain it a bit now later on when I'm going to make some of my other points. Here, what you're seeing is essentially zero is a cohort that goes from 1982 to 1985. And it's people who are tracked over time over that 1982 to 1982 to 1987 period. And what it's being looked is what of people who are in the bottom decile, so these people who are tracked over that 5-year window, how much extra deciles up do they end up by 1987? And then the next window, the next point on the line is 1983 to 1988, 1984 to 1990, et cetera, et cetera. You just keep shifting the window by 1 year with different people inside at every point. They're just tracked at over time. For most provinces in Canada, there is decline in the intra-generational income mobility. So these, by the way, I want to point out, Ontario is Canada's largest province. It has had a decline. So you can see that in the 1980s, people in the bottom decile, 5 years after, they're 3 deciles higher in the income distribution. It's fallen to a bit less than 2.7. The second largest province is Quebec in Canada. It had a small decline and then stagnated. The ones that look like there's some increase, these would be, you can see like Newfoundland and Labrador and Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island is the size of a village. It's 150,000 people, so it's a very small, starts from a low level. Newfoundland and Labrador is the size of 2 villages, so it's a bit larger than the other one. It's the only other one that had a marked increase. The bigger provinces, ergo the lion's share of Canada's population is experiencing a decline in intergenerational income mobility. And when you shift to intergenerational income mobility, you find that there is good sign that across uh, most Western countries, there's signs of weekly falling income mobility. So this comes from a paper by Manduka et al. So I took the graph that was most visually appealing, but their most recent version, I think, is published for this in the Journal of Economic Literature. It's a really good article. It's worth reading just for the quality of the treatment of the literature that comes in. And on the axis here, you're going to think about BERT cohorts. So this is people in 1960. How many of them experience upward income mobility in absolute terms? So they exceeded their parents' earnings by, I think it's age 30 or something like this. So Sweden, this is saying 65% of people born in 1960 at age 30 had higher earnings than their parents. For most country, it looks like it's declining. The U.S. comes mostly from the Raj Chetty kind of work. So you're getting here a picture of some signs of falling income mobility. Why is there a connection? It's this graph here. So this is the famous or infamous Great Gatsby curve, and it posits the idea that income mobility is going to fall with income inequality. So here, what you're seeing is on the y-axis is generational earnings elasticity, and the higher the proportion here, the less mobility you have. So that means you're more persistent in your social standing in the income distribution. So this you want to think of as the following. Anything on this axis is saying, okay, if you start at a certain point in the income distribution, how likely you are to stay at that point, and that point is relative to your parents. So if the relation is closer to zero, it means that on average, anyone can jump up the income distribution to much higher levels, adjusting for whatever growth there is on average for society. A rich person can fall down, a poor person can jump up. The more this is a larger proportion, you are saying that your parents' standing is a strong determinant of your relative standing. The connection with income inequality, so that you have more inequality as you go to the right on this axis, is you want to think about this as that inequality is generating constraints that are limiting people's chances to jump up. So the poor have too tight of a constraint and they can't seize certain welfare enhancing opportunities, and thus they are stuck into their social classes as a result. So essentially it limits the ability to seize opportunity for upward ascension. I am not going to contest this. That's not the point that what I'm trying to say is I'm going to try and say that there is a rival to this that minimizes the importance of this relationship, that it exists, but that there's a conditional aspect to it. And the reason I say there's a conditional aspect is I'm going to argue to you, and this is I've yet seen anyone make this argument, is that there's such a thing as good inequality. So I'm going to use a very extreme example here where I'm going to ask you to picture a Benedictine monk and a hedge fund banker. Both of them, the hedge fund banker earns more than the monk. And not only that, I'm going to allow the monk's income to increase more slowly than the banker. Now, if offered to trade position for the banker's position, the monk refuses, what are we to make of the meaning of inequality in that society? In a case like this, you would actually have this fictitious society that is based on monks and bankers. You would have a high level of inequality that is increasing over time, given the parameters I've discussed. But the refusal of the monk to shift position for the higher wages, with the assumption that he has the ability to shift, so it's not a lack of abilities, well, then what meaning would we make of this? It's not a meaningful point. Actually, here, you might want to think that this is even a good inequality, because there is a subset of the literature that finds that while income inequality has increased in Western societies, inequality in life satisfaction, so how people say they're satisfied with the trajectory of their life courses, that inequality has fallen over time. So this is in reference to Stevenson's and Wolfers and Clark and all. And you want to think that in very rich societies, highly developed societies, pathways to what people define, whatever pathways they have to what they prefer, uh, there's more pathways that are available. And the strong correlation between well-being and the income will be less visible. So yes, income will mean higher incomes on average society will speak to better living standards, but the distribution of it might not reflect this per se, especially if you have people who have uh, think about like a backward bending labor supply curve. It could be that some people who are highly different than others are more financially ambitious, so they're willing to substitute leisure for labor much more for a longer period, a longer range than other people who are closer to being target earners. Once they reach a certain target, they just enjoy a life of leisure. In societies like this, the great wealth might actually generate great heterogeneity in the way people can exercise their preferences, and thus you would end up with inequality in a case like this. But it's not meaningful inequality. In fact, we should judge it as a good form of inequality because it's reflecting in practice people's choices, freely made choices that are not coerced or not the result of being handed a worse hand. All right, so I'm making sure that I'm classifying because there's going to be two other types of inequality. There is also what you could call neutral inequality. Uh, so actually, the first point here, first bullet point, I'm sorry, is it should have been on the previous uh, previous slide. The other ones here are should be on the neutral one. So apologies for this slight hiccup. So there are some of them. It's hard to make a value judgment on it. So for example, assortative mating is one of them. Assortative mating is the idea that you in the past it was possible, for example, if you were a banker and you married your secretary because she was pretty, it wouldn't matter if she was pretty from a poor background or pretty from a rich background. As a result of that, you had some upward mobility via marriage that would happen. But today, this is not the same pattern that people have as marriage. What you'll find is lawyers marry lawyers, professors marry professors, and you will rarely find interclass marriages, much more than this. And there's this really nice paper by Bruce Greenwood and all. And what they find is if you had a random marriage, I'm not sure this is a really great idea, but sometimes it's useful for simulation rather than assortative mating. You find that the increase in inequality that occurred over the period that they're considering is actually there's a much milder increase in inequality over time. So what they find is the much lower level of inequality, and that difference that they find is explains, I think, like 50% of the increase that's observed. So it's hard to make a statement over this that assortative mating is it's I understand that it leads to more persistence in terms of classes, but it's okay for people to marry who they like. So this is why I say neutral. It's hard to make a judgment on this. And the other point, so as I said, the top point should have been in the previous slide. The other one is that there's composition biases, and this one is just aging is causing a different interpretation of inequality because you're having older people who tend to have older workers, but I don't mean like old workers, I mean closer to prime age. You've moved the age of the mean worker over time. The result of this, and you have reduced the relative shares of different groups of workers, and the result you're getting some form of composition bias. For example, this is Tammy Shirley from Canada. She did resimulations where she held population age weight, weights for different age groups constant, and she finds that it explains, I think, 10% of the increase in inequality. Magne Mogstad did the same work with Norway and the US. with aging. Found also that yes, there's still an increase, but a share of that is from just aging. And although I don't like aging personally, I was happy when I was young and could wake up early in the morning and just do everything I wanted and not have a just sleeping in the wrong position causes the next day to be horrible. I miss those days, but it's hard beyond that to say anything about aging per se as a form of bad inequality. But there are bad inequalities, which is the last one I want to get to. And this comes from an article that is underappreciated in the American Economic Review by Finis Welch. It is provocatively called In Defense of Inequality. And he makes the first iteration. So he's the first to have made that categorization. He just doesn't use the nomenclature that I do, and he doesn't push it as far as I'm trying here. But he has this definition of what he views as bad inequality. And he says this: inequality is destructive whenever the low wage citizenry views society as unfair, when it views effort as not worthwhile, when upward mobility is viewed as impossible or as so unlikely that its pursuit is not worthwhile. And here he doesn't go more into this and how you would decompose bad inequalities, but there are two types of bad inequality. You would get either from inheritance. So this would be that being born in a particular place to a particular parent causes you to never be able to jump up on the income ladder. So you were born poor and you were born poor in a bad place, you're stuck there. That is a bad form of inequality in and of itself. Uh, but the other one is not that you're being held up by dint of birth, you're being pushed down by bad policies. And I'll define more about bad policies, but then this is where the role of public policy can come in either as a positive or as a negative in fighting bad inequality. And this reclassification of the different types of inequality, going back to the graph I started with, when I told you not to freak out, can change massively the interpretation of economic history. So let's just go back for a second to that graph I had at the beginning. So the blue curve is what you start with. The red curve is the modifications I briefly told you about that I did. Green ones is the one David Splinter and Gerald Otten has done. So what you're seeing is the U curve shifts down and the end tips are being bent a bit away. So the slopes at near the ends are not as high. I'm going to argue to you that the slope is even faster before the 1920s. So the high levels is collapsing a little. So this is from work that is currently under review, where I correct for the role of within the United States of regional price differences that may affect our understanding of real inequality over space, showing that there is once you make adjustment for local price levels, you're getting a bit more of a fall of inequality before the 1940s, so that the decline before the 1940s is a bit different. And there is also an issue, and this is it has to be mentioned. Whatever I showed you, you could drop at least before 1960, you can drop everything until 1940, you can drop everything an extra 20%. And the reason for this is Americans until 1943, tax reporting was voluntary, which is, you're going to guess what happens. Reporting quality is very, 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 very low. And not only that, audits are made of largely higher incomes. So when there's auditing, it's made mostly to rich people. People who are closer to the exemption threshold tend to lie much more. And what we did, me and Phil Magnus, is we used state income taxes. So some states had income tax systems, and some of them had very hardcore enforcement that that the federal government didn't have. And then we compared the income tax data from these states to those from the federal government, and we get an entirely different story. And so what you want to get here is that each different type of points is a state. So red is Delaware, green is I think Minnesota, The golden dot here is Utah. I have a North Carolina here, and the blue one is Wisconsin. This is one of the results, and what you're seeing here is once you use the better quality state level data, you find that generally, and the Delaware ones is purely an artifice of the way the data is constructed for the income denominator. Once we remove the income denominator issues, everything is above the one line, and the line of one is saying what? It's saying that the IRS estimates are larger than the state income estimate. So that means that it says, like, for example, if it's a 1.1, the IRS data would say that income inequality is the top 1% has 33% has 10% of income. Then the state level estimate would actually say it's 9.1% rather than 10. So you'd get like a 10% reduction. It'd be a 0.9, point level reduction. So it's saying that the IRS systematically overestimate. On average, the overestimation by the IRS is 18%. It systematically overestimates by 18%. So you can drop everything an extra 18%. And not only that, the drift seems to get larger over time. So it's higher towards the issue that the measurement errors that come from using federal data is larger towards the 1940s before mandatory tax withholding is done. Lastly, the Piketty and size data has one last little issue that people don't know about is they make arbitrary changes to the income denominator so that when you try to use a consistent methodology, you don't try to shift between income definitions over time. You try to use a single definition with no arbitrariness to it. You get a slightly lesser increase by the 2000, and this is not using the Otten and Splinter stuff. So you're getting that the level is down, the trends are lesser towards the tails. Okay, why does this matter to this interpretation of income inequality that I've just given above? The reason why is, first of all, the timing changes. In the usual story, the collapse of inequality on the left side of the U curve is due to tax policy in the 1940s. Now, in the story we tell with the corrections, it's bad inequality in the source of there's the Great Depression. The Great Depression causes a series of hard shocks that hurt people massively. But weirdly enough, it hurts rich people more. So when you look at inequality that accounts for capital gains, most of the decline in inequality is wiping out capital gains. But this is not exactly what type of inequality we judge good, because it means that some people are suffering immensely. It's just that others closer to the top are falling larger proportional income, but they're still well above extreme poverty, whereas many people in the US fell below a very uncomfortable threshold. Second, you're getting, so actually I should shift to the next table, is you're getting a very different type of mix of why you're getting the fall as well. So some of it is the Great Depression. So that's the bad part. Another one is, for example, that Black Americans move from the South to the North. So the work of Leopold Booston shows massive wage gains for Black Americans. So people at the bottom experience massive earnings gains, and that's from migration. So this is a good form of reduction that comes from people being able to access opportunities. There's another bad inequality in a certain way, and this is something that I harp on in the US, is everyone says, oh, immigration increases inequality. Yes, it will. It's just a mechanical shit. I'm sorry to cuss here. The reason I say this, it's purely mechanical, because unless the distribution of earnings of immigrant is exactly identical to that of the host population, it's going to increase. If all the immigrants are earning more than the native population, it's going to increase inequality. If they're all earning less than the average inhabitant, it's going to increase inequality as well, because you're including a distribution with a different mean and a different variance, and it's going to change the entire thing. But what you have to think is, it doesn't mean that actually we've reduced inequality globally. So when you have immigration of people from Haiti to the US, their income actually increases by a factor on average of 5. That means they're 5 times richer. Globally, you've reduced inequality of all Asians and all Americans bundled together. But if you're just measuring in the US, actually it's going to lead to more inequality in the US. But globally, because you've allowed people to move from poor places to rich places, you've actually reduced global inequality. The US are part of the reason why they get the decline in inequality before the 1960s is you get the reverse of what I've just described. The US is restricting immigration and is preventing people from poor countries to access the quality of American institutions. And so what happens is you stop having that composition bias that comes from a large number of influx of people who populate closer to tails of the income distribution, but technically reduce global inequality. So this reduction in inequality for the US is actually like a bad thing. So from a global standpoint, it's a bad thing. And there's also an issue of composition bias, or there's a neutral part. Now you take the right side the of the curve, there is some good inequality that is happening. So here you had, for immigration, it was bad equality because you were preventing people from moving. Some of the rise in inequality since 1960 is there's been immigration reform since. Number of immigrants have come in, and it causes back the mechanism I initially described. You get more immigrants, you get more inequality. But actually, if you look at the income gains they have and the effect on native earners, then no one is made worse off. And in the global distribution of people of the host countries and this, you will find that they're better off, which actually is consistent with findings by like Xavier Salah Martin that finds that inequality of all individuals around the world has declined since relative to the high point of the 1960s, and a share of that comes from migration. There's also a composition bias issue for the part that explains parts of the increase post 1960, and this comes from population aging. But in the bad inequality, and I'm going to expand on this a little, like we're literally on the next slide, is there's actually in the United States there's the rise of labor regulations, occupational licensing, land use regulation, product regulation, all of which have the effect of raising inequality in a way that limits opportunities. So why, and now I want to explain why I'm emphasizing this one, the ones that come from policy, is I want to give you a direct connection between inequality and income mobility. The I'm going to use a microcosm here. So this comes from one of my papers. This is from the Journal of Institutional Economics. And in the Journal of Institutional Economics, the idea me and Vadim Kofenko had was, what if? And it's an easy what if. We found a microcosm that speaks to the connection between inequality and outcomes. And the idea we had is the Olympics. Olympics actually would fit this. There are a group of people who have an innate talent. It is given to them by some force of nature, and they are good. And this is going to be randomly distributed relative to income. The talent that people have innately is going to be randomly distributed with respect to income. But there is a cost to developing these talents, and that cost is easier to bear for higher income people. That means that if you want to measure the idea of when countries send their athletes to compete in Olympics, countries with high inequality are not going to be able to send their best athlete. They're going to send their best athlete conditional on having been able to pay the cost of developing these skills. And you want to think of the outcomes of medals as kind of a proxy for how much do the innately talented poor are able to participate in society. This is why I say it's a microcosm. And we find that, yeah, inequality does predict lower medal counts in Olympics, but that is not true for countries that have high levels of economic freedom. And what is it, economic freedom? It's essentially the level of protection of property rights, levels of regulation, tax burdens. And what we find is actually in high economic freedom countries, the effect disappears, and actually it's the effect of institutional variables overswam this. Why? Because it kind of creates a reverse effect. And the argument we make is, if you're a poor person in a society where property rights are immensely secured, you are telling people that the rewards from developing these skills are not going to be appropriated away from you or taxed away or stolen from you. It creates an incentive to effort that would not exist in their bad institution. Obviously, that means that the sweet spot is to have low inequality and high level quality institutions. But here, what we find is actually the effect, if you want to do a horse race, the effect of the quality of institutions is much more important. And again, bear in mind that we're using this as a microcosm for saying, okay, here you're seeing when inequality has a negative effect, when the bad inequality materializes, is its bad outcome is in settings where there are things that push down the poor that come from institutions that enhance the dent of birth issues that are created. And I want to do you, this is the initial DAG that we did, is you want to think about the quality of institutions is doing two things. And here I'm using the economic freedom indices from the Fraser Institute, and largely because I'm a participant in the Fraser Institute. First link you want to think is, so first of all, let's look at income inequality. We want to think that income inequality does affect intergenerational income mobility, so the chances of the poor of rising up. That's the Great Gatsby's curve. What I'm arguing now is that we have to bring in the role of institutions. And this is economic freedom. Economic freedom will have a direct effect on income mobility for people at the bottom to rise up on the income ladder if you're not putting hurdles in their way. So if you say you have to acquire a license to be a barber, not that I need it personally because the amount of hair I have doesn't require a barber, but let's say I required one. No barriers, no strong barriers, no over regulation means people can jump more easily. That's a direct effect, but there is an indirect one. If there's economic growth and you want to think about the extra income is probably marginally more important for people down the income ladder, the effect of economic growth is going to be, so beta 2 here, it's faster economic growth will actually enhance intergenerational mobility. There are signs of this in the literature, but there's also another literature that points out that economic freedom really has a strong, like you do a meta-analysis of the 1,300 studies that use economic freedom indices on either income levels or growth, 85, 86, something like this percent of them find a consistent positive pattern with income levels and growth. So it actually says, so here via alpha 1, there's the alpha 1 beta 2 is added to beta 1 as the effect of economic freedom on intergenerational income mobility. So the next few papers I'm going to show you is when you look, and the literature on income mobility never says this. If you consider the literature on income mobility, the three thing it does is it will speak about education, it will speak about social capital, and it will speak about inequality. They never speak about the stuff I just said about the role of letting markets as free as we can. And notice I'm going to make a distinction in a few seconds between what I call intervention and redistribution. That's going to matter. For now, it's going to sound like I'm a free market radical. And those who know me, I have very strong classical liberal priors. I'm actually trying not to make a strong classical liberal position, as I'm going to allow in the last slide for this, a case for a better welfare state, because there's a case to be made that actually can complement the stuff I'm talking about. But for now, just assume I'm some form of free market radical. And here, first consideration that I gave to the role of economic freedom in determining income mobility. Again, this is the idea that we want to prevent the bad inequality from materializing as an effect, that it's pushing down poor people and preventing them from rising up in the income distribution. So I told you earlier about that Canada data that used the rolling cohorts, the rolling windows of people. What I did with James Dean, my best named co-author. I wish it was the actor, but James is also pretty goddamn awesome. He's a great friend, great co-author, but he has the coolest name I've ever seen of everyone I've ever worked with. And I've worked with Paul. Paul, I like your name. That's not the issue, but James Dean is a pretty cool name. But what we did is we used the economic freedom data, but for sub-national levels. And we found that for Canada, the absolute mobility, so how much higher your income is by the end of the period, but also how far on the income ladder you've jumped. So how many rungs have you increased? All of them are related to either the tax burden that is there, or to the the level of labor market regulations. Government spending doesn't seem to have an effect, and this is going to matter in what I'm going to say next. But we find an association. It's not causal yet. Uh, we find an association where higher levels of economic freedom predict higher levels of economic mobility. And just to show you, this is the province in Canada with the lowest level of economic freedom. It's also the province I'm hail from, which is Quebec. The red one is the actual data for that province. So this is the share of people in the bottom decile, how much extra rungs high up they jump. So you see that over time it has declined. So in the early 1980s, people could jump as much as 2.7 deciles up from the bottom. So that means that person who started in the bottom 10% would end up being in the middle of 30, the 30th to the 40th centile. So he's somewhat of a better, happier camper, but it fell over time. The blue line is saying, what if Quebec had the level of economic freedom of the highest economic freedom province, and that is Alberta. So this is the Canadian, one of the Canadian prairies. And you find that the level is massively higher, but the trend is also slightly different. So that's an association finding. Other people have found the same thing. So this is from Christopher Boudreau. He takes the data on intergenerational mobility for countries, and he finds that some components of economic freedom, so this is the rule of law, for example, so the security of property rights, promotes income mobility. The EFW here, that's the economic freedom of the world, it seems to have an impact to some degree, but not when accounting for the initial levels of income. One of the arguments I make later is actually this: you shouldn't control for log of GDP because you're only considering the direct effect I showed you and not the indirect effect. So this is probably true to the total effect of economic freedom, but he had a slightly underpowered sample. He had only 25 observation. In subsequent work with Justin Calais from University of Louisiana, we actually found the data set and took a long time to understand everything behind it, where there is income mobility for people born in the 1980s for more than 100 country. And then we replicated some aspect of the strategy of the previous paper. And what we found is here actually a negative is a good thing. So we just didn't flip the signs around. We find that essentially there is less persistence across generation. That means that there's more mobility when you consider the index as a whole. So this is the effect in terms of in percentage point. You want to read this essentially as saying, regardless of balance and unbalances, some countries are we're missing some data over time, and then lifetime is we're missing some data over controls, not over this, but lifetime is we're averaging the value over your lifetime when you were for the birth cohort in the 1980s, how much average economic freedom you had over your lifetime. Results are somewhat similar, and you find that on the whole it's positive, but the most important bits, which is LSPR is legal system and property rights, and regulation, the two of them together seem to be the most important in determining better income mobility than otherwise is. But you might want to say, okay, this is all non-causal. This is all, sorry, I'm going to move a bit. Oh, yeah, there's another one I want to mention. Same thing here. So this is data for the US. So we retook the Chetty et al. Paper, and this is for connectedness. So this is his paper about how social capital matters to income mobility. We decided, okay, let's take all your 600 commuting zones in the US and let's match them with the metropolitan statistical areas economic freedom index that we have. And here what you're seeing is Again, this is associational, so this is not yet causal. This is the stuff that Chetty and all mentioned, so that people in the most areas with the greatest level of social capital between people, you get 13% more mobility relative to the first quartile that's not shown. So it's 13% more than the worst one. For relative mobility, which is how much rungs on the ladder you climb, it's plus 12%. If you compare it with the effect of economic freedom, same division, it has a very strong potential. But now you could say, okay, all of this, Vincent, is bullshit. It's just associational. There could be some weird setup, some weird endogeneity problem. I accept all of these criticism, which is why I did the next paper, is the province of Canada. So we're going back to Canada. I'm really sorry about this. You guys are hearing way too much about Canada. We decided to take, there's one province in the 1990s, Alberta, that did a shit ton of reform, and I really mean like crazy stuff. They slashed government spending by 30% on a per capita basis over like 2 years. They privatized 3 or 4 crown corporation. They took the entire business code, rewrote it, cut the number of pages by like 3/4. They installed a flat tax. They reduced corporate taxes. They essentially froze the minimum wage relative to median wages. They liberalized the energy market. It went from being a middling province, if you take the index of economic freedom, it went from being a middling province to being the freest one, not just in Canada. It was freer than the freest American state. Uh, Huge jump, huge discrete jump in policy. So what we do is, okay, let's use synthetic controls. Synthetic controls, we have the data I showed you. Let's use the other provinces that did some reforms but didn't do as much. So the causal effect we're capturing with synthetic controls here is the effect of the extra set of reform that Alberta did, the crazy set of reform. And we want to check if there's a difference between a counterfactual Alberta that is based on the other provinces and the one that actually is the real one. So here what you're having is all the different measures of income mobility we have. So this is how many more deciles up a person is if he started in the bottom decile 5 years after. This one is what share of people have had a jump of more than they jump more than 3 deciles up on the income ladder. And then what you have here is what is known as per capita dollar mobility. It could take me 25 minutes to explain this. You just want to think it's conceptually similar to the other ones. The solid black line is the actual Alberta. The dashed line is the synthetic / counterfactual Alberta. The difference between them, you want to think of them as the causal effect. And the effects are significant using the simile p-value test that you use for synthetic controls. All of these are significant. At the bottom, what you're having is absolute mobility. So how much higher gains have you had as a share of income? So not as a share of income. How much growth you've had in your income over 5 years. You can see at the end this is saying your income from the bottom, 10% increased. If it's a 4, it means it's increased 400% over 5 years. This is saying that it went from being 450%. Sorry, here the difference is, let's say like you're getting an extra 100% of economic growth. This is the percentage gain of people in the bottom 10% who've had income gains of more than 200%. And again, this means that only 60% is predicted in the counterfactual, as opposed to 65% who have income gains over 5 years that is more than 200%, which means that essentially income triples. So this is huge, huge proportions of causal effect. We did it with a battery of different tests. It holds across everything. The reforms were so big, they had a positive effect. They boosted up income mobility in the province, eliminating essentially the effect of bad inequalities. But now it looks like I'm making like a very free market radical case. I want to say that that's not what I think we are saying, because in some of the results I showed you that kind of stuff like size of government didn't seem to matter. What mattered was property rights and regulations. And there's another paper. This one is a revise and resubmit at the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, again with James Dean. We looked at poverty transition, so how much time it takes you to exit low income status, so crippling poverty in Canada. We find that same set of association that we've described, but we find also that government spending doesn't have any negative effect on upward mobility. The only actually government spending that do is government consumption. When you're looking at insurance schemes that government provides or direct transfers, it actually looks like there's the inverse effect. And I want to make an argument, which I think, well, anyone in Scandinavian countries will end up saying, yeah, we like this, is it comes from this article by Andreas Berg, and Andreas Berg calls this a Yekian welfare state. And he distinguishes size of government according to this nomenclature, and I think it's a very good point, is states that are big because they're trying to regulate and intervene and shape economic outcomes directly by participating in market are going to have much larger negative effects and even than states that all they do is do the simplest forms of taxation possible with the smallest deadweight law, and then they do transfers that are either targeted transfers or unconditional transfers to people to help them rise up. You want to think of something like not necessarily this is, I'm not saying this is what Canadian countries do, but you want to think of the ideal in this would be like a universal basic income or something like this. The point he makes in a situation like this is that that second type of big government is not as costly as the first one. So that actually means that there is a strong case, given my earlier result that I mentioned, that maybe making a distinction that would be necessary. And Berg is not the only one to do this. Actually, Peter Linder doesn't know he does it, but in this latest book, he actually does that distinction. He just doesn't phrase it in the same words. And this is my former professor at the University of Montreal, Marcel Boyer. He calls us competitive social democracy. I like the term because it keeps some of my earlier left-leaning reflexes that I've kept as a classical liberal, and I was happy to read something like this because like, there's some of the stuff that survives from my past, and maybe I'm seeing my heart's desire. I hope not too much, but Marcel wrote this very beautiful book. It's worth reading. Marcel was an economics professor at the University. He's still an economics professor at the University of Montreal. But the thing I want to say is from this, I want to point out that in fighting, if we want to care about fighting bad inequality, it's going to be my conclusion. There's a difference between intervention and redistribution. Intervention, the findings are much clearer. Now, when I say interventions, is essentially governments are trying to intervene to shape markets. Either they're doing it for rent-seeking purposes, or they're doing it for other weird national defense, national security stuff, but they end up hurting mobility. So this is housing regulation that restrict the housing supply, making cities, which are hubs, great productivity hubs, not accessible. Occupational licensing that increase the cost of shifting between professions. Product regulation that increase the cost of certain goods more than others, especially goods that might weigh more heavily in the basket of the poor. Hiring and firing regulations that make employers who are risk averse more averse to hiring employees with fewer skills or fewer proven skills, so they don't want to take a risk as much, or they do sorting beforehand. Obviously, trade barriers, violation of the property rights, all of these would fit in the box of intervention in markets. These, I think, reducing these types of policies will get you the reductions in bad inequality that you would desire. But because there's the other part of bad inequality, that is stuff that comes from the dint of birth, that just being born in a particular place or being born in a particular income group means you're stuck there. And actually, some targeted transfers would make sense. So you want to think about the mix of policies that I think come from this reading of inequality and economic history that I'm doing as making a case for reducing government interventions in market, but reforming welfare states to make them more targeted, to make sure that the goal of welfare policy is to push people up in terms of opportunities, thus respecting the very idea that Lyndon Johnson handed. The idea is to give a hand, is to give a helping hand, not a handout. It's to help out, not the handout. And I think that's the point. It's not, I think this is the point I'm trying to make to you guys. And I'm going to end it here before I think I will be over time, and Paul will be pissed at me for some reason, an understandable one.
It's very